few weeks ago, Morus-Baird over on the Celtic Source channel made a video that caught to my attention. I liked it so much that I asked him if he minded me making a reaction video, and he said sure, so here we are. I've edited these clips for length, but you can find the whole video, which is only about 10 minutes, at the link I've shared. But anyway, let's have a look.
This circle stands for everything you might call spiritual in the Celtic cultures. To start finding our way around the circle, let's split it into two halves. On the left, M is for myth, the stories, poems, sacred narratives and symbolic worlds of belief. Then on the right, P is for practice, what people actually do, rituals, roles, habits and behaviours. Here at the top, this F stands for folk. This is the common people. Throughout history, the folk told their own versions of the stories and used whatever practices worked, regardless of where they came from. They weren't powerful, they didn't control many resources, but they kept their cultures alive in their own way. Before the Romans conquered Britain in the year 43 of the Common Era, Bronze Age and Iron Age Celtic cultures had both sides of the circle working together. Myth, stories of gods and heroes and sacred order, and practice, the priestly world of the Druids and other specialists. Then as Rome took control of Britain during the 1st century, they persecuted the Druids and forced them underground. The native practices they took care of, especially amongst the Celtic elite, became more difficult to access. The sacred stories probably continued, but the public, organised practice would have deteriorated. We can guess that, more often than not, the space left behind was filled by Roman cults and influences. But even though the people in power, closest to Roman governance, may have begun to lose connection to their native religion, the people who lived further away from that Roman influence would have maintained their native beliefs for far longer.
I really like the clarity of that. Sometimes we struggle to discuss religion and spirituality because the terms are messy, and this cuts through some of that difficulty. If there's anything that bothers me, maybe it's his folk, because he doesn't really define them as well, or maybe I'm just not fully convinced. I mean, I get the class struggle, really I do, but I'm not sure spirituality or belief divides along those lines very neatly. But that's a small niggle. Let's go on.
Around the year 380 of the Common Era, Christianity becomes the official religion of the Roman Empire. From that time on, Christian religion increasingly becomes the dominant type of spirituality in the Celtic regions, especially amongst the elites. Practice becomes the domain of Christian priests. But what about the native myths? Well, some of us believe they survived in oral storytelling and were eventually written down by various types of scribes. These myths would have naturally evolved and changed in this Christian-dominated culture, but they still carried the potential for spiritual meaning, as they do today. So by the Middle Ages, the myths had largely become a type of literature, written down as stories not only to entertain, but also to inspire and educate.
That's a great synopsis of 500 years or so of history. And I think we also see the long-standing habit of preserving lore or preserving myths at work here. A way of seeing it as worth keeping that probably gets transferred consciously or unconsciously from the Druids and bards to the new classes of poets and monastic scribes.
Meanwhile, the folk kept doing what the folk always do, evolving their own storytelling traditions that were adjacent to the classical myths, and in practice just using what worked. Charms, local rites, seasonal customs, sometimes in a Christian style, sometimes not. They continued to tell their stories and express their beliefs, reinventing their own spiritual culture from generation to generation.
Yeah, I like this acknowledgement of that folk practices are ever evolving. The people of the countryside in the 18th century, or even in the medieval period, they didn't have the same beliefs and practices as pre-Christian cultures, even if, like the elites, they managed to carry some things forward. As he goes on, this next bit becomes more specific to Wales, quite naturally. So, of course, how things went in Scotland or Ireland is similar in some ways, but not exactly the same.
By the early modern period, the Celtic nations were in various stages of colonisation, and even if they were officially Christian, many of their native myths had already been preserved in manuscript, as well as continuing to evolve in folk culture. Then we arrive at the Industrial Revolution of the 18th and 19th centuries. In Britain in particular, antiquarians and revivalists started taking an interest in native Welsh traditions. The exotic figures of the Druid and the Bard captured the imagination of English and Welsh alike. Some people looked at the circle of Celtic spirituality and noticed that if you took Christianity away, the native practice was missing. Some myths were preserved in old writings, but the native circle was ultimately broken. Some people, like Iolo Morgannwg in Wales, experimented with new forms to bring native practice back to life, but it was still heavily influenced by Christianity. This is where many modern Druid orders trace their roots. This early type of Druidry was influenced by Freemasonry and Hermetic or high magic. Unfortunately for the folk, during the Industrial Revolution, their communities and culture experienced a devastating uprooting, the collapse of their local economies, often forcing them to leave their homes and move to the industrialised cities, or to emigrate in hope for a better life. We can guess their spiritual culture, by now a mixture of Christian and native paganism, slowly but surely disintegrates and breaks down.
Notice that at this point he takes the folk out of the top of the circle. The Industrial Revolution and the New World Order that accompanied it really scattered communities and moved populations around as people went where the jobs were. Not just to cities to work in factories, but also to new rural locations for things like mining and forestry. Of course, folk practices and storytelling continue, but it gets shuffled to new locations where new regional hybrids emerge as displaced groups of people kind of bump up against one another. And some beliefs and practices die out. That said, we might call the country people Paganus in the Latin sense of the word, but they weren't capital P pagans in the sense we mean it today. They were Christians with a rich tapestry of customs and beliefs which they wove in amongst what the churches taught them and expected of them.
In the 20th century, more and more people were drawn to the idea of native spirituality in both Britain and Ireland, and therefore they were drawn to the Celtic myths. We have things like neo-paganism, Wicca, Celtic shamanism, Celtic Buddhism, and many more. But here's the problem. Beginning with Iolo and throughout the following centuries, there's been an intense focus on practice, and very often those practices come to overshadow the myth. When practice starts telling myth what it must mean, the myth gets obscured. The Celtic stories are reduced to aesthetics or flavour or vibes for imported practices. In some cases, we end up with modern practices that look Celtic, but continually fail to actually learn from the meaning inside the Celtic myths themselves.
Oh, yes, I like that idea, that too much focus on practice can obscure myth and the danger of practice telling myth what it must mean. That bit really stood out for me.
When practice starts telling myth what it must mean, the myth gets obscured.
Yes. This idea that too much focus on practice can obscure myth and the danger of practice telling myth what it must mean. This is really the bit that stood out for me in this video. And again, he states it really clearly. Now, people or groups develop a bit of dogma or want to do a certain kind of ritual or see the gods in a particular light, and then they try to impose that idea on the mythology or simply rewrite myths themselves to fit their practice.
Take the idea that medieval bards or Irish filly were shamans. Some elements in the bardic cultures of Ireland and Wales certainly look shaman-like, and scholars have noted parallels. But turning that into the Druids and the bards and the filly were all shamans is a misrepresentation of the Celtic traditions. That's practice projecting its categories onto myth instead of learning from the myths first. The major problem here, of course, is in misrepresenting historical identities. There are still Celtic peoples in Ireland and Wales and Scotland and Brittany and even Cornwall and the Isle of Man who still consider themselves to belong to the Celtic cultures. To misrepresent their history is to misrepresent their identities.
Yeah, he's just using the idea of Celtic shamanism as an example here. But why does Gwyll think this is important? I mean, for one thing, we see a lot of this. People take things like the Welsh understanding of Awen or the use of Irish ogham writing and use them to give a Celtic gloss to some modern practice they've developed. Celtic words lose some of their original meaning when they get turned into jargon of an imported or invented practice. The Celtic word and its origins just add a bit of mystique. It gives people the feeling that they're insiders to the culture. If you'd like to delve a little deeper into the topics in my videos, you might enjoy taking one of my online classes. There's almost always something on offer. Some classes have tiered pay what you can pricing, and there are usually a few scholarships available for the more expensive classes. To get notifications about classes and about scholarships when they're announced, you can go to my website and subscribe to my newsletter or follow me on my Patreon page. I've noticed a dichotomy growing up in modern paganism. So we have the belief that things can be divided into open practices and closed practices. The idea that if a culture or a religion announces our practices are closed to outsiders, then that should be respected. And of course I agree. But a lot of people seem to think that because Celtic cultures have not shut the gates, then it's complete open season. You can take what you want out of the culture, you change it all around, call it Celtic, just because you have a compelling idea, or maybe you had a Scottish granny or something, and that this is going to be just perfectly fine. And yeah, you can do that. And if you do it in private, no one will care. Enjoy yourself. But if you bring it into the public sphere, promote it on the internet or in the streets, then while you haven't broken any laws, it's just not very polite. It's not very ethical. The word does tend to get back to people in the original culture, and it can cause them discomfort. Enough of that, though. It's really this thing about myth and practice which felt most important. I think Gwyll and Morus-Baird and I are in pretty close agreement about all this, but there are some differences in what it means to us, too. I'm pretty sure Gwyll doesn't consider himself to be a neo-pagan. He's a friend and an ally, but not a practitioner. He isn't really looking for any polytheistic practice at all, as far as I know. He's probably more of an agnostic than a theist. He's secure about where he fits into his own culture and his cultural practices. He's keen to help preserve some of those practices and to teach mythology. As a polytheist myself, I understand why other polytheists are eager to build a practice with systemized beliefs. But if we jump in without knowing the myths very well and build on shaky ground, we can create practices based on poor quality information or wrong assumptions. To be clear, I don't think there's any harm in inventing new practices as long as you don't misrepresent them as something ancient and culturally authentic. But it seems like many people quickly become so practice-based that they never really bother with the myths. Even when they ask for information about a specific deity, they rarely want to study the myths associated with that deity. But the type of learning content that caters to that desire to cut straight to the chase is often very low quality. Shortcuts turn out to be dead ends. Not only are you telling myth what it must be, but now you're telling a deity who they must be based on someone else's personal understanding, which might be modern or garbled in ways which ignores the original lore of that deity. If you build your practice on that, in time, you may find out that the information you were given was wrong. And this realization can be really tough on people. It's never easy finding out that something which feels deeply meaningful is mistaken. It's natural to feel embarrassed about your mistake, to feel angry at the source of the misinformation, and it's natural to feel like you can't trust sources anymore. Like you can't trust yourself to assess the quality of sources, or you can't trust yourself to interpret evidence. But actually, primary sources for the myths aren't that hard to find these days. That's one reason why I leave a trail of web links and names of books wherever I'm teaching. There are plenty of trustworthy resources, and many of them are free, but you have to engage with them. My own devotion to the gods is mostly expressed through study. My main offering to them is to teach and write. I'm here to tell you as accurately as I can what the myths say, what old inscriptions and other information about our gods is. I'll try to help you interpret that evidence, but I don't see it as my job to tell you what action you should take, how to organize your practices. So if you started looking into Celtic polytheism recently, you may imagine that you're approaching a fully developed tradition of some kind. But this isn't the case. Individuals and small groups have developed some practices. Depending on the person or group, those practices may be based on mythology or folk practices. They could come from outside sources, or maybe they just created something that worked for them. And that's fine, as long as they're honest with you and with themselves. But I draw the line if people are changing or misrepresenting the myths in order to fit their practice. To my mind, mythology forms or evolves from within a cohesive culture, which is already carrying the lore of many previous generations. It isn't a question of myths never changing, but it is a question of who gets to make the change. Is it coming from within the culture? Is it coming at least from lore keepers who know the myths well? Or is it coming from more eclectic places, authors and influencers who are just suiting themselves? If someone wants to sell you their version of things, they may have a vested interest in telling you that the primary sources are hard to access or that there's something wrong with them. Oh, the myths can't be trusted because of Christian influence or because of a few imperfect translations. By telling you things like that, they're actually keeping you dependent on them for your knowledge. I'm not saying that Celtic pagans can never evolve a culture or have our own lore keepers, but we're not there yet. I think that we're really too immature as a movement to start rearranging or reimagining the lore when so few of us are sufficiently grounded in it. I keep hoping that as we grow in numbers and maturity as a movement, we'll develop a critical mass of lore keepers who are trustworthy and have breadth and depth of knowledge about the myths and about the folklore and the history and customs of different Celtic-speaking cultures. As a movement, I think we could be a generation or two away from that. If we don't achieve that, we're going to discover that our practices and our whole movement is fragile and can't carry us very far. So I invite you to study the myths, to speak up for them, become something of a lore keeper in your own right. I'm definitely here to help you if you want to do that.